So what do we do at Tech Against Terrorism? Well, as explained, we're a public-private partnership, which means that we endeavour to work with members of civil society, governments, and of course the tech sector. We're focused on ensuring that technical solutions to the terrorist use of the internet respect human rights, and it's critical that we engage all parts of civil society and the private sector to that end. We work closely with big tech, but most importantly with smaller platforms for whom the challenge of terrorist use of their service is greatest. Smaller platforms can often find themselves exploited by terrorists without notice. They can become overwhelmed very easily. And our job at Tech Against Terrorism is to build capacity for those smaller platforms who are most easily targeted by terrorists. The scope of our work focuses on designated groups. The reason for this is that we aim to uphold the rule of law in not creating new norms where terrorist use of the internet is concerned. We believe that it's critical for nation states, for democratic nation states, to define legality and criminality online. And we believe that also applies to terrorist content and activity. Our focus is essentially an amalgamation of the major designation lists. Of course, we work with jihadist groups and violent Islamist groups, as listed here, and also with the extreme far right. However, the issue with the extreme far right is that designation is much less developed. So you'll see on the far left column, TCAP, the Terrorist Content Analytics Platform, which I'll explain more about in a few moments, is the tool we use to alert smaller platforms to the existence of content. So we endeavour, where possible, to include in scope the broadest range of groups associated with the extreme far right. However, there's much more to be done to provide legal clarity about the status of these groups and the extent to which the global tech sector should or should not be removing content associated with them. We focus on all forms of terrorist use of the internet, not just content, but also other forms of activity. This starts with propaganda, radicalization, recruitment, operational use cases, and emerging tech. In terms of propaganda, radicalization, recruitment, this is the majority of our focus at Tech Against Terrorism, for this is largely how terrorists use the internet to share content, to share videos, and to share manifestos. Additionally, in terms of the operational use case, we see that terrorists of all persuasions use email, messaging apps, end-to-end encryption, and also hostile open source intelligence. They also use the internet for fintech and crypto, although this is a minority pursuit. The majority of the terrorist use that we come across involves sharing content. Underneath this, there's a major emerging trend with regards to terrorist-operated websites, which I'll come back to in a few moments. And of course, there's emerging tech, and David Sharia from UNCTED mentioned a few of these a few moments ago. In particular, I'd like to draw everyone's attention to the emerging risk of use of decentralized file servers, cryptocurrencies, and decentralized messaging platforms. In terms of our work at Tech Against Terrorism, the first thing we do is we focus on understanding the nature of the threat. It's really important to stress here that long gone are the days when terrorists would exclusively use the large platforms. Of course, they do still. The prevalence of content on the large platforms is extremely low, but of course, with such a huge audience reach, that adds up to a large amount of activity in absolute terms. In reality, terrorists use smaller platforms first, and they do so because they're easier for them to use and can often operate with impunity for rather a long time. So our main job here is understanding where this activity is taking place, which platforms are being used, who is behind those platforms, how to contact them, how to influence. We then conduct a threat assessment on each, and we reach out to platforms in order to influence them. We are merely a public-private partnership, and we can only persuade, but we're there to support platforms, and we never call them out. We don't seek adverse publicity to name and shame platforms. Secondly, we provide practical support. We share knowledge about best practice for content moderation. We support platforms in understanding emerging regulation, and we also support them with detailed training. In particular, we support the Global Internet Forum to Counter-Terrorism in mentoring platforms so that they can become members. And thirdly, we build technology. So there's the terrorist content analytics platform, more of in a few moments. We also support the tech sector in alerting when there's a real-life crisis to ensure that the internet can't become exploited after a physical attack. So in terms of the problem set, small platforms are actually increasingly being used by terrorists. Long gone are the days of high concentration of terrorist activity on the major tech platforms. To be clear, though, activity does still take place on Instagram and Twitter and YouTube. However, usually activity and content emanates from smaller platforms. So we're seeing a major adversarial shift from the large to the small platforms, which presents a formidable challenge analytically and also in terms of intervention. We see the far right and violent Islamist actors beginning to use technology in similar ways, but there are some distinctive differences. And that's where we come in at Tech Against Terrorism in working with the GIFCT and others. In terms of emerging trends, well, firstly, if we focus on violent Islamist extremism, firstly, we're seeing a worrying resurgence of terrorist-operated websites. More of that in a moment. We're also seeing emerging use of decentralized technologies. That's to say, file storage services that are, in principle, impossible to moderate. There are now services that make it impossible to remove content once it's put on the internet. Most of these are quite difficult to use, and terrorist actors are fairly lazy. So there are some easy targets in terms of traditional platforms that they're still using in abundance. So it's important to stress here that whilst there are some exotic and emerging forms of technology emerging, the majority of terrorist use of the internet is still pretty basic. And it's important that we focus on that first. Thirdly, we're seeing migration to micro file sharing platforms, and these are the type often that terrorists can build themselves. So we are seeing a trend towards terrorists building their own sites, their own services, their own apps. And that presents a new challenge because, well, you can't exactly reach out to the terrorist organization to ask them to turn their website off, can you? And the ethics of this and the legal ramifications are more complex. In terms of extreme far-right terrorism, we are beginning to see these actors mimicking approaches and methodologies previously perfected by violent Islamist extremists. And increased use of decentralized technologies as well. There are a number of specific trends in terms of the use and activity of extreme far-right groups in conflict zones and the overlap between private military contractors and neo-Nazi organizations in Ukraine. And a lot of this is being seen on the internet as well. So in terms of the terrorist use of the internet, it's critical to stress this isn't just about preventing it or stopping it. It's also often about understanding what's happening in various terrorist organizations, which presents an opportunity for improved understanding. Our major concern right now, of course we focus largely on smaller platforms, is what we term terrorist-operated websites, TOWs. Historically, terrorists and violent extremists used forums, so in the early 2000s, quite basic sites. And neo-Nazis did the same, Stormfront, infamously. With the advent of social media, however, most of these services became redundant and were no longer used. However, in the case of going back to the future, what we're now seeing is hundreds of terrorist-operated websites exist. Most of them will stay online for years. Most of them host terabytes of material. And to be clear, there is little point the big platforms and the small platforms removing content here and there if there are hundreds of websites that are freely available, freely accessible, with terabytes of material. There are IS-affiliated TOWs, many of which have been operating for years. And of course, there are equivalents for the extreme far right. And very little, if anything, is being done about these. This is gravely concerning. So at Tech Against Terrorism, we call on the international community to figure out what to do here. The problem with terrorist-operated websites is that they're often obscured, and they're difficult to determine the location. So we ask for support from governments to identify who is hosting these TOWs and to work to remove them. Going on to the terrorist content analytics platform, the TCAP, which was originally funded by the Canadian government and will continue to be funded by the Canadian government and the US. Using this tool, we track, verify, analyze, and alert terrorist content to smaller platforms on the internet. And since its launch, this has been tremendously successful. In practice, what we do with the TCAP is our team of open source intelligence analysts will identify high likelihood groups and channels on smaller platforms. We will assess the provenance of those groups, the extent to which they're associated with designated terrorist organizations. And then we will automatically scrape and crawl the material that's found and report that to smaller platforms, which means that in practice, we're able to support smaller platforms in removing content within 5 minutes of it being posted. And the core of this methodology is to find where terrorists are operating. They don't go first on Facebook. They go first on their platform of choice, whatever that might be. And we aim to be there so that when they post that content, we can catch it, we can capture it, we can alert it and have it taken down. IS, Al-Qaeda in particular, have a content distribution strategy that's based on parallel posting. So IS will post content on 30 smaller platforms at once. And using our technology, we're able to get to this within about 5 to 10 minutes. So as you can see here, in terms of the submission alerts, we're talking around a few thousand a month, which doesn't sound like a lot, but what we're talking about here is the original content as posted by IS or extreme far-right organizations before it gets elsewhere. So the intent of this is to prevent terrorist content spreading from the epicenter on smaller platforms. And we're pleased to say that more than 90% of the material we refer to smaller platforms is removed. And we aim to extend this. So in terms of the next year or so of development, firstly, we'll be expanding the alerts to platforms, so enhancing our monitoring capability. We already cover around 100 platforms, but there are certainly more that could do with enhanced monitoring. We will start alerting terrorist-operated websites and emails. Terrorist groups, and in particular the extreme far right in the US, use email accounts as part of their propaganda campaigns. And we're pretty good at getting to those email accounts within minutes of them being shared on flyers and taking down those email accounts to disrupt the propaganda campaigns that they're running. Secondly, we'll be working on archiving content. It's important that we're not just alerting, we're archiving, we're keeping a copy of this material so that it can be audited. We're not here to set norms, we're not here to tell platforms what to do. We want to create a system that's transparent. We'll also be stripping out PII, so that it's GDPR compliant, in order to promote more ethical research in this area. And we'll be creating and sharing hashes of this. Thirdly, we'll be expanding the alerts for crisis, for offline crises. So in particular, after events such as Buffalo, we work to identify copies of that content on small platforms and have that removed and alert that accordingly. So in terms of recommendations, firstly, we believe improved crisis alerting is needed so that when there's a physical terrorist attack, platforms are better at removing that content quickly, and in particular smaller platforms, and that requires 24/7-hour coverage. Secondly, as I've said, we believe there needs to be significantly more focus on terrorist-operated websites. Simply put, there's no point focusing on big tech or small tech if terrorists can create their own websites. It's absurd that so many of them are online for so long. Thirdly, we would like to encourage the international community to focus on regulation in a way that makes sense for smaller platforms. And thirdly, of course, ensuring that smaller platforms are supported. Often the policy debate is exclusively about the big platforms, and it's right and proper that the big platforms are in scope. But in reality, terrorists kind of focus on the smaller ones. So we need to make sure that smaller ones are provided support so that enhanced regulation and legislation doesn't undermine smaller platforms. So with that, I will hand back. Thank you very much.